By 1944, the United States Army had fielded the most technologically advanced ground force in human history. Radar, proximity fuses, the atomic bomb was months away from completion. And yet here was George S. Patton, the architect of modern armored warfare, the man who turned tanks into the cavalry of the 20th century, carrying a firearm design that predated the light bulb. His peers, Omar Bradley, Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, all carried a standard-issue Colt M1911, the most reliable semi-automatic pistol ever designed. 8 rounds of .45 ACP in a magazine that could be swapped in seconds. It was the obvious choice, the rational choice. Patton rejected it. Instead, he bet his life on a 6-shooter from 1873 and a .357 Magnum revolver, weapons his own army considered obsolete before the First World War had even begun. Was this vanity?
The theatrical excess of a man who loved the spotlight more than tactical sense? Or did the old cavalryman understand something about combat that we've forgotten? Something about reliability under pressure, about the psychology of killing, about what it truly means to be armed? This is the story of why America's most famous general refused to carry America's most famous pistol. To understand why George Patton chose the weapons he did, you have to understand when he chose them, and more importantly, who he was when he made that choice. George Smith Patton Jr. was born in 1885 into a family where war wasn't just history, it was heritage. His grandfather had been a Confederate colonel who died leading a charge at Cedar Creek. His great-uncle had fallen at Gettysburg. The stories of cavalry sabers and desperate mounted attacks weren't tales from books. They were family legend, passed down at the dinner table.
When Patton arrived at West Point in 1904, the United States Cavalry was still the elite branch of the Army. Tanks didn't exist. Airplanes were curiosities. The horse was still the fastest way to move soldiers across a battlefield, and the saber was still a weapon of war. And the sidearm of the American cavalrymen? The Colt Single-Action Army, the gun that won the West, the same revolver that had ridden with Custer's 7th Cavalry, that had been holstered on the hips of Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, that had settled more frontier disputes than any treaty ever signed. The Colt SAA wasn't just a firearm to these men, it was a symbol, a connection to the mounted warriors who had conquered a continent, and young Lieutenant Patton absorbed this ethos completely.
In 1912, at 26 years old, Lieutenant George Patton represented the United States at the Olympic Games in Stockholm, Sweden. He competed in the modern pentathlon, a grueling 5-event competition designed to test the skills a military courier would need behind enemy lines: shooting, swimming, fencing, horseback riding, and running. Patton finished 5th overall, first among all non-Swedish competitors. In the fencing event, he placed 4th, and in the shooting competition, a controversy erupted that would define his reputation as a marksman. The judges ruled he had missed the target entirely with 1 shot. Patton insisted he was so accurate that the bullet had passed through an existing hole. The judges didn't believe him. History would prove that believing George Patton's claims about his shooting was usually the safer bet.
But it was what happened after the Olympics that truly shaped Patton's philosophy of personal weapons. Following Stockholm, Patton traveled to Saumur, France, home of the French Cavalry School and the finest swordsmanship instructors in Europe. There he trained under Adjutant Charles Clary, the beau sabreur of the French army, studying the aggressive thrust attack techniques that Napoleon's cavalry had used to devastate enemy formations at Wagram and Austerlitz. When Patton returned to America, he carried with him a radical idea. The U.S. cavalry was using its saber incorrectly. The curved, slashing weapon that American troopers had carried since the Civil War was inferior to the straight, thrusting sword favored by the French. He wrote a detailed report titled The Form and Use of the Saber and submitted it to the Ordnance Department.
In 1913, the Army adopted his redesign, a straight-bladed thrusting weapon that would become known as the Model 1913 Cavalry Saber, the Patton Saber. He was assigned to the Mounted Service School at Fort Riley, Kansas, as both student and instructor. His title? Master of the Sword. the first American officer ever to hold that designation. This is the man who would later choose his sidearm. Not some desk-bound bureaucrat, not a theoretician who had never drawn a weapon in anger. A master of the sword, an Olympic-caliber marksman. A cavalry officer who believed that the personal weapons of a warrior were extensions of his will. And when that man looked at the new M1911 semi-automatic pistol that the Army was issuing to its officers, he saw something troubling. Here's something civilians rarely consider. A cavalry officer fights with one hand.
The other hand is occupied, holding reins, controlling a 1,000-pound animal at full gallop, keeping that animal pointed at the enemy while chaos erupts on all sides. A cavalryman who can't operate his weapon with a single hand is a cavalryman who's about to be killed. The Colt single-action army was designed for this reality. Cock the hammer with your thumb, squeeze the trigger. Repeat. Every motion is deliberate, rhythmic, controllable. A skilled shooter can empty 6 rounds with mechanical precision while his horse is moving at 30 miles per hour. The M1911? Different story entirely. Yes, it's a single-action pistol, but if you need to chamber a round, you're racking a slide. If you need to clear a jam, tap the magazine, rack the slide, reassess. If your magazine runs dry, drop it, insert a fresh one, release the slide catch. All of these manipulations are easier with 2 hands.
Some of them, under stress, practically require 2 hands. Patton, trained to fight from horseback, evaluated weapons the way a cavalryman would. Could he run it with one hand? Could he run it without looking? Could he run it while his other hand was otherwise engaged? The revolver passed. The semi-automatic did not. In September 1915, Lieutenant George Patton was assigned to border patrol duty with A Troop of the 8th Cavalry, based in Sierra Blanca, Texas. It was remote, it was dangerous, and it was the closest thing to the Old West that still existed in the 20th century. Patton wrote home describing the local cowboys who wear boots and spurs and carry guns. He was fascinated by them. These weren't soldiers bound by regulations. These were men who lived or died by their ability to handle a firearm. At the time, Patton was carrying the Army's issue M1911 Colt 45 semi-automatic pistol, standard equipment for an officer.
The proper, regulation choice. He wore it tucked into his belt, no holster. One night, Patton was in a local saloon, and his M1911 discharged. The bullet struck the floor. No one was injured, but for Patton, a man who prided himself on his weapons handling, who had competed at the Olympic level in shooting, the incident was devastating. Various accounts suggest different causes. Some say Patton had been tinkering with the trigger mechanism, filing the sear to achieve the hair trigger pull he preferred for target shooting. Others say the gun simply slipped. What's certain is that the M1911, with its complex combination of grip safety and manual safety, had failed in Patton's hands. He never trusted it again. Shortly after the incident, Patton ordered a brand new Colt single-action armor revolver from the Shelton Payne Arms Company in El Paso, chambered in .45 long Colt, ivory grips.
He would carry variations of this weapon for the rest of his life. Patton wasn't simply embarrassed into abandoning the semi-automatic. He developed a comprehensive philosophy about why revolvers were superior combat weapons, and that philosophy centered on one word: reliability. Years later, Patton explained his thinking to his nephew, Frederick Eyre, Jr., who would later become a senior FBI agent. According to Eyre, Patton's reasoning was precise. The auto was an arm of 2 parts, while the revolver required nothing other than loose ammunition. Also, the pistol was totally dependent on the condition of the magazine for proper functioning. Think about what Patton is saying. A semi-automatic pistol has 2 critical components that must work together: the gun itself and the magazine. If either fails, the weapon fails.
And magazines, spring-loaded devices exposed to dirt, sand, moisture, and impact, fail. A revolver has one component, the revolver. If a cartridge fails to fire, you pull the trigger again. The cylinder rotates, a fresh round aligns with the barrel, bang. No tap-rat-bang malfunction drill, no fumbling with a slide release, no questioning whether the magazine seated correctly. Just pull the trigger. Patton put it bluntly:
The automatic pistol was a fine noisemaker for scaring people, but it was well to practice with the revolver if it was going to be necessary to fight with handguns to live. There's another dimension to Patton's reasoning that rarely gets discussed. What happens when weapons fail at the worst possible moment? The M1911 operates on a short recoil system.
When fired, the barrel and slide travel rearward together, unlock, and the slide continues back to eject the spent casing and chamber a fresh round. It's an elegant system when it works. When it doesn't work, when there's not enough lubrication, when sand has fouled the rails, when a cartridge feeds improperly, the slide locks partially open. The gun is dead in your hand. Clearing that malfunction requires 2 hands, time, and attention. In combat, especially the close quarters combat that officers most often face, you may have none of those things. A revolver doesn't jam, not in the conventional sense. A dud round, pull the trigger, the cylinder advances, the next round fires. It's mechanically closer to a self-contained system than a semi-automatic will ever be. Patton was thinking about the moment when things went wrong. The moment when an officer, surprised by an enemy at close range, drew his sidearm and squeezed the trigger, and the gun had to work. No second chances, no do-overs. In that moment, he trusted the revolver. If you've seen the movie, you remember the line. A reporter asks about Patton's pearl-handled pistols. Scott, as Patton, unleashes a tirade. They're ivory. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans whorehouse would carry a pearl-handled pistol. The real Patton said almost exactly this, multiple times. The distinction mattered to him enormously. Why? Because pearl was associated with gamblers, criminals, show-offs, men who carried fancy guns to impress people. Ivory was the material of warriors, saber handles, ancient artifacts, weapons wielded by kings. Patton's ivory grips weren't decoration, they were communication. They told everyone who saw them, "This man is a warrior. This man comes from a warrior tradition. This man will kill you." That communication was entirely deliberate. Patton understood something fundamental about command. In the chaos of battle, soldiers need to see their leader. His uniforms were deliberately theatrical. The polished helmet, the cavalry boots, the riding crop. Every element was chosen to be visible at a distance, recognizable in an instant. So that when things went wrong, when communications failed, when plans collapsed, the soldiers could look around and see, there's the old man. He's still standing. We're going to be all right. The ivory-handled revolvers were part of this system.
They were beacons. In this portion of the text, the author discusses how George Patton's choice of sidearms was a calculated tactical decision rather than mere vanity, intended to make him easily identifiable to his troops and intimidating to his enemies. The narrative highlights the psychological impact of his gunfighter persona, noting that German leadership viewed him as a particularly dangerous commander. It recounts an instance in North Africa where Patton's aggressive response to an aerial attack further solidified his reputation among his soldiers. The focus then shifts back to 1916 during the Pancho Villa expedition. While serving in a staff role under General Pershing, Patton orchestrated a motorized raid on a ranch to capture one of Villa's top lieutenants. The resulting gunfight, described as being reminiscent of the Old West, resulted in the death of the target and marked a turning point in Patton's career.
This event not only brought him national fame as a bandit killer, but also validated his reliance on his specific ivory-handled revolver in close-quarters combat. Would you like a summary of the next segment of the text? No time to clear a jam or reload a magazine. Patton's Colt SAA had performed flawlessly. 5 shots, 5 hits. The weapon that had won the West had won again. Patton took Cardenas' silver-tipped saddle and spurs as trophies. They would remain among his prized possessions for the rest of his life, physical proof that his equipment choices, his tactics, his entire approach to personal combat had been validated in blood. After San Miguelito, Patton never seriously reconsidered his choice of sidearm. The M1911 might have been the Army standard. The M1911 might have been what everyone else carried.
But George Patton knew what had worked when it mattered. He trusted the revolver. By World War II, Patton had refined his personal armament into a deliberate system. His primary weapon was still the Colt single-action army, the same basic design he had carried at San Miguelito, now fitted with custom ivory grips bearing his monogram and the stars of a general. This was his everyday carry, the weapon that rode on his right hip through North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. On his left hip, he carried a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum, the registered Magnum, purchased directly from Smith & Wesson in 1935. This was what Patton called his killing gun. The .357 Magnum cartridge, then new and devastatingly powerful, delivered nearly twice the muzzle energy of the .45 long Colt. If the Colt SAA was his symbol, the Smith & Wesson was his solution to serious problems.
This is where Patton's philosophy becomes interesting. He actually carried backup guns, a Remington Model 51 in .380 ACP, a Colt Pocket Model hammerless, a Colt Detective Special .38 revolver. Wait, pocket semi-automatics? From the man who distrusted semi-automatic pistols? Patton was pragmatic, not dogmatic. As he explained it, although he liked big revolvers, he was of the opinion that .32 and .380 autos were more effective than similar revolvers with the ammunition then available. The distinction was between primary arms and backup arms. Your primary weapon, the gun you're counting on to save your life, should be the most reliable system available, a revolver. Your backup weapons, the guns you're carrying as insurance, could be semi-automatic because you're not depending on them the same way. It was a layered system, belt and suspenders.
And beneath the theatrical exterior, it was entirely practical. Here's what's remarkable. Patton's approach to personal weapons anticipated modern special operations doctrine by half a century. Today's elite units, Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, the British SAS, are famous for allowing operators to customize their equipment. The philosophy is simple. The person doing the fighting knows what works for them better than any bureaucratic standardization process. Patton believed this in 1915. A warrior's weapons were personal. They should be selected based on individual experience, individual training, individual confidence. The standardization that makes sense for supplying a million-man army does not make sense for the officer who will be making life or death decisions at the tip of the spear. General officers in World War II had enormous latitude in their personal equipment. Patton used that latitude deliberately, creating an armament system that reflected his beliefs about combat, reliability, and personal capability. He was, in this sense, the first modern tactical individualist. We can distill Patton's thinking about personal weapons into a few core principles. First, reliability over capacity. 6 rounds that fire every time are worth more than 15 rounds that might jam. Combat rewards consistency, not statistics. Second, simplicity under stress. When everything goes wrong, and in combat, everything always goes wrong, your weapon should require the minimum possible thought. Point, pull trigger, repeat. Third, the weapon is a message. What you carry says something to your allies and your enemies. Make sure it says the right thing. Fourth, personal confidence matters. A weapon you trust is more valuable than a weapon with better specifications.
Belief in your equipment translates directly to performance under pressure. Fifth, never draw unless you intend to kill. Patton said this explicitly. The handgun should never be drawn and pointed unless it was intended to shoot to kill. The weapon is not for threats, it's for ending fights. George S. Patton died on December 21, 1945, from injuries sustained in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He was 60 years old. Does that mean his choice of sidearm didn't matter?
Hardly. The revolvers were part of how Patton led. They were part of how his soldiers saw him. They were part of how the Germans feared him. In an era of industrialized warfare, of millions of interchangeable soldiers carrying interchangeable weapons, Patton's personal armament declared, "Here is an individual. Here is a man who makes his own choices. Here is a warrior." And the practical reasoning beneath the theater was sound. When Patton chose revolvers over semi-automatics,
He was making a calculation about reliability, simplicity, and confidence that modern firearms instructors would recognize immediately. Was he stubborn? Absolutely. Was he theatrical? Beyond question. Was he a man who loved the image of the Old West cavalryman and was reluctant to let it go? Without doubt. But he was also a man who had tested his equipment in combat and found it reliable.
A man who understood that the psychology of war matters as much as its technology. A man who knew that the warrior's choice of weapons reveals the warrior's understanding of war. George S. Patton chose revolvers over the M1911 because he believed from experience, from study, from a lifetime of martial philosophy, that they were the better tool for the job he was doing. History has not proven him wrong. If this deep dive into Patton's thinking changed how you see the legendary general, hit subscribe and the notification bell. We explore the hidden logic behind history's most famous decisions, the calculations that made legends.